Welcome to this week's edition of World Crisis Radio. This is Webster Tarpley speaking from Washington, D.C. The Kiev fascist regime is disintegrating before your eyes. That was pointed up on Wednesday when the scant military forces, a bunch of poor, underfed, cold, hungry draftees, apparently, in some light tanks from the Ukrainian army, tried to launch an attack in eastern Ukraine, and they were soon surrounded by townspeople, and they quit. They gave up. They threw in the towel, and those light tanks passed to the pro-Russian forces there in the eastern Ukraine. So this is yet another episode of the disintegration, the collapse of the state apparatus itself. And this nasty Turchynov that you've now become accustomed to seeing on TV from his podium there in the infamous Rada of Kiev, he's got nothing behind him. He's a sawdust Mussolini. He's making threats, but there's nothing to back it up. Sawdust Caesar was the original. He's a sawdust Mussolini, many steps down, or maybe he's a sawdust Codrianu or something like this to get it closer to where he is. Now, we're going to talk about the economic reasons for this. It's uncanny how this stuff is going. The uncanny part is that in 1918, it was the looting of Ukraine by its own sponsors. That is to say, the German General Staff of Hindenburg and Ludendorff that drove the Ukrainian population into the arms of Moscow. In those days, it was Lenin and Trotsky ruling in Moscow. Communists though they were, the Ukrainian peasants said, let's go with them. These guys have got to be better than the Rada or the British-French puppet Skoropadsky. And you remember the name suggests that he's going to fall soon, and soon fall he did. But this time around, it's the Troika, the International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, and the EU Commish, meaning the Portuguese neo-fascist Barroso and Olli Rehn, from Finland. Finland, of course, a country that was closely allied with Hitler. And we'll have some connections also on Denmark, the dirt in the recent history of Denmark that we see represented today by Anders Fogh Rasmussen. Yes, that's his name. We'll have some puns about that on the Twitter feed. But let's try to catch up with these recent events. The big picture is that we've just had a Geneva meeting, a conference in Geneva, among Skull and Bones Kerry, taking time off from celebrating his 50 years since he was tapped for the infamous Skull and Bones Society. Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov was there, a man of character and an intellectual worthy of note. Again, superior morally, intellectually, humanly, far superior to the imperialists he was surrounded with. So Kerry, Lavrov, Baroness Ashton, remember the woman who was so dumb and so ill-prepared that she had to do her confirmation hearing to the EU Commish twice to try to retrieve her failure the first time around. And this guy, Deshitsia, yes, that's his name. I'm sorry, I'm not indulging any profanity here, but Deshitsia for Ukraine. You can see the wonderful public relations sense of these characters in Kiev. Anyway, they met and they came up with this roadmap document, which is primarily what can we say? It's a fig leaf for many things. But the principal idea is that the illegal armed groups should stand down, okay, and that those occupying public buildings should disencumber. They should leave those public buildings and restore them to the rightful occupants or owners, and that those seem to be the main points that the world, the Western media are paying attention to. But of course, this is an agreement that regards all of Ukraine. All. It's not just eastern Ukraine. It is not exclusively directed against the pro-Russian forces in the eastern Ukraine. It's supposed to be all of Ukraine. Today, we've had an interesting back and forth on all kinds of media here. We can take even the Associated Press and the National Public Radio news reports in the morning saying, a setback has emerged because those mean and recalcitrant pro-Russian forces in eastern Ukraine, they're refusing to lay down their arms and to vacate the buildings they have seized. This is an outrage. The Russians are violating, because, of course, they interpret these people as being 100% controlled by Putin, which I think 100% may be too much. Certainly there's significant influence and some control, but how much? This is a little bit harder to say. But notice, the great principle of international affairs and international law especially is reciprocity. Sauce for the goose, sauce for the gander. Turnabout is fair play. What you do to the other guy, he's allowed to do to you. So therefore, the amazing feature of the coverage here in these controlled media, where the collective hysteria against Putin and Russia is the strongest, is that they don't seem to realize that this is supposed to apply to all of Ukraine, and in particular, the right sector and the Svoboda Party. Their armed fascist Sturmabteilungen, their squadracce, their goon squads, continue to occupy the Maidan, so-called Independence Square, in Kiev. And I think they still may have a foothold or a toehold in some of these buildings. Maybe they're occupying that building that they burned out, the trade union headquarters, because, of course, these are fascists. They don't like unions. Always, whenever you find a fascist, you've got a union buster on your hands, and they qualify, right sector and the Svoboda Party. So, obviously enough, when the Associated Press, or whoever it was, called the head of the People's Republic of Donetsk, out there in the pro-Russian East, he said, we are waiting to see whether the fascists of Maidan vacate the public square and whatever buildings they have and lay down their arms, and then we'll consider what we will do. In other words, reciprocity. But, of course, this concept is far too nuanced for Samantha Power or Kerry or Newland or Pyat. I'm suggested that Pyat is the U.S. ambassador to Kiev, of course. Pyat meaning 5 in Russian, probably in Ukrainian too, something similar. That might have been his fee, right? 5 rubles, right? Whatever it was, or $5 at some point. The family fee. I don't know for what. But anyway, they ignore the fact that it's got to be observed by all. And this is really interesting. One of the leaders of the People's Republic of Donetsk has pointed out, and we even have people in the street saying this, that the Kiev fascist regime, the junta, the fascist clique, is an illegal organization itself. And therefore, a literal application of the Geneva Accord would be that the Kiev fascist regime should dissolve and leave the public buildings that it has occupied, meaning all of them in Kiev. Back in a minute. Welcome back to World Crisis Radio. We urge you to keep up with everything at Tarpley.net, Tarpley.net. What you have up there is an in-depth historical analysis. Most recently, this is an interview that Bonnie Faulkner of Guns and Butter out in KPFA San Francisco, but then also WBAI in New York repeats it. You can get the link to that. You can listen to that at tarpley.net. This is a comprehensive, in-depth analysis of the history of Ukraine. Ukraine is a Potemkin nation. It's an artificial state. It is not viable. It cannot survive. All of these economic discussions, and we'll get to them, revolve around the fact, which nobody seems to want to recognize, that this is an impossible proposition. There can be no independent Ukraine. Politically, I think the unity is now impossible. I don't know how federalism could even work because the mistrust is so huge. But most of all, Ukraine is totally integrated into the Russian economy, and it may not be otherwise. You could imagine some kind of a cooperative venture of the European Union, Russia, and Ukraine, but this is exactly what Barroso and Olli Rehn and the rest of them refused. And in doing that, ironically, they are repeating verbatim the analysis, the policy of Hindenburg and Ludendorff, who said, we want to make sure that Ukraine is exclusively an economic colony of the German General Staff. We want to keep the Russians out and use it to keep the Russians off the Black Sea, cut off the Russians from the Balkans, and so forth. So this is now being repeated, and it's uncanny. We'll have more written about this, but you can already get the main ideas in the article that's up there, which is Metaphysical Doubt the Existence of Ukraine. Is this really a country? Who told you this is a country? It's only been there for 21 years. It's either been it's primarily been an Orange Revolution NATO puppet state much of the time. All right, we'll get back to this in a minute. Now, I also want to point out, for any residual, what can we say, pro-working class people, you notice the people in Ukraine, East Ukraine, those are workers, railroad workers, miners, steel workers. Those are industrial production workers. That's got to stand for something. Compared to the petty bourgeois that you find on the Maidan, right? These ideologues, right? Really, very little has changed since the antics of the Ukrainian Rada in 1918 and around that time. Now, therefore, the entire government, the fascist regime that has set itself up, is totally illegal. It qualifies as an illegal armed group. It's illegal, and it claims to control an army. Now, of course, the army is melting away. The army is disappearing like the snow on a sunny day, right? It's the Frosty the Snowman divisions that they seem to have. They're going to be evaporated soon. So I think there is very little prospect of anything coming out of this Geneva conference being seriously implemented. Now,